Hello, and thank you for joining us in One Slot. I'm Felicity Ezewuike, your host. Let's begin. Ukraine's 44 million plus residents woke up to an all-out military attack from Russia last Thursday. There had been hope that the threat of economic sanctions from the EU and America would deter Russian President Vladimir Putin from taking this drastic action. It didn't. So far, more than 600,000 people have fled the conflicts to neighboring countries. That's according to the United Nations. As in the rest of the world, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is casting a shadow across Africa. Despite the geographical distance, there are important ties between Ukraine and Africa, including more than 8,000 Moroccans and 4,000 Nigerians studying in Ukraine and over $4 billion in exports from Ukraine to Africa. Of particular interest is the treatment of Africans trying to flee the conflict. Yesterday, the African Union condemned incidents of racial discrimination against Africans being documented on social media. The matter also came up during a meeting on Ukraine at the UN Security Council, where the African members of Council denouncing what they termed the mistreatment of African people, especially students, trying to flee Ukraine. Beyond these issues, what lessons or insights can Africa glean from this very dire situation? Let's call it what it is, major power competition. My guest today is Steven Gruzd. He heads the Russia-Africa Project, South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg. He has published widely on governance and the African peer review mechanism and keenly follows African political developments. Steven holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science in International Relations. I want to say welcome and thank you for giving us your time, Steven.
Thanks, Felicity. Great to be here on One Slot.
It is no doubt a really complex situation, but for us to get this conversation started, I think we should maybe attempt a simplified version of events that led to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
So it's not an easy one to untangle, but I will go back a little bit into history to try and make sense of what we're seeing at the moment. So, of course, Russia and Ukraine are neighbors in Eastern Europe and have a very long history of cohabitation, migration, conquest, and so forth. Even Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, 6 months ago, went into a very long history lesson. And what he said is they're essentially one people, and there's no such thing as Ukraine or Ukrainian nationalism, which is hotly disputed by the state, the independent Republic of Ukraine. But both fell under the rule of the Tsars. And then what was interesting was when Russia was admitted to the United Nations in 1945, it asked for separate seats for some of the Soviet republics, mainly Ukraine and Belarus, which at that time was called Byelorussia. They actually had separate seats in the UN in addition to Russia. Anyway, Russia and Ukraine were both members of the Soviet Union from 1917 right up until 1991, when in a democratic poll, 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence. So they moved away from the Russian sphere of influence, or they were trying to, and became an independent state. That situation has existed for the last 30 years. What's caused this most recently, I think if we go back to 2013, so Ukraine has had a lot of different governments. They've either been pro-Russia or anti-Russia. And in 2013, the country was making moves towards looking at accession to the European Union and perhaps to NATO. And the country was about to sign an association agreement with the EU when Russia offered them a huge loan not to do so, and they accepted the loan, which caused protests, and eventually the government fell, and a new government came in that was not to Moscow's liking, and Russia sent troops in 2014, which resulted in the annexation of Crimea to Russia, which was not recognized by many other countries apart from Russia. But also what happened was in the east of the country, in the Donbas region, most people there are, in fact, Russian-speaking. And they declared themselves independent and were fighting a low-level secessionist war to try and leave Ukraine and become their own republics since 2014, so basically for 8 years. What changed the game was that on Tuesday last week, Vladimir Putin said that Russia is now recognizing these regions as autonomous and is going to support them. And there have been troops building up on the Ukraine border with Russia for many months. And in the early hours of Wednesday morning, Russia decided to attack, saying that it was going in to be a peacekeeper because the rights of these people living in Luhansk and Donetsk were being abrogated, and they had to defend them, and this was the only way. And so a full-blown invasion of Ukraine resulted that we have seen over the last week. Hundreds of people have been killed, as you said, 600,000 refugees, a desperate situation, and a situation of a big country throwing its weight around at a small country on its borders. That's about as simple as I can get. There are lots of things in between which we can chat about, but that's the basic outline as I understand it.
Yeah, I think you actually captured everything for somebody that's trying to get an idea what's going on. Let's flip back to your explanation and try to see if that is the giving independence to these people, if that is actually the reason why Russia is in Ukraine. Are there issues that goes beyond the reason that Russia is given for their action?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, Russia, remember, when the Soviet Union existed, it was a superpower. It was taken seriously in the Cold War. It had and still has nuclear weapons. It had vast territory. It's still the largest country in the world, but the Soviet Union was much larger. And when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and then through to 1991, this mighty empire collapsed. And the countries that made up the Soviet Union, they were called republics, became independent. So you have the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. You have Georgia, you have Ukraine, you have the stans, so Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and others. And so Russia lost this place on the international stage of having these countries within it. And the Soviet Union, which was then became Russia, and these states became independent. And Putin called this the greatest tragedy of the 20th century and is determined to try and reverse the result of the Cold War. So Russia has long said it has a sphere of influence, that it's near abroad, as it calls it. The countries around it should not be hostile to Russia, should not join Western alliances like NATO, and that this was threatening to the very existence of the Russian state. I mean, they've also made spurious arguments, for example, saying that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis and by drug addicts, absolutely preposterous, insulting, and degrading, and a very flimsy excuse. And so Russia is trying to regain the glory of the Cold War days, the glory of the Soviet Empire. And it started a war in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine and Crimea, taking the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, and now this time. And I think it thought it would be a very quick war, that the Ukrainians would just fold, that President Zelensky would either be killed or exiled, and Russia would be able to call the shots and install a puppet government in Kiev that would be more pro-Russian in its orientation.
Well, it doesn't seem to be playing out that way, because we know Zelensky is sitting tight and refusing all offers to leave the country. Well, you mentioned NATO, and I know it's the name keeps coming up in the conversation between Russia and Ukraine. I'd like you to explain, as much as you can, why Russia believes that Ukraine joining NATO will sort of take away its powers, really, and affect its borders.
Okay, so NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was formed at the beginning of the Cold War in 1949. It now has 30 members, which are mostly Western, Central, and some Eastern European states, as well as Canada and the US. It was a defensive alliance, and in 1955, Russia formed the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet Union plus countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, etc., to face off against NATO. Now, these two alliances never actually engaged in a hot war. The Cold War deterrence between them held. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some argued that NATO had no more reason to exist. But it did exist, and it started expanding towards the east. So in 1997, it brought in some members, and I think what upset Russia the most was in 2004, it brought in the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And Russia then argued that this alliance was on its borders. But actually, NATO has been on Russia's borders since 1949 because Norway is a member, and Norway shares 200 kilometers of coastline, of border with Russia, or with the former Soviet Union, but it is Russia. So, in fact, NATO has been on Russia's doorstep, but I think for it, losing Ukraine to NATO is seen as an existential threat. It's a step too far. It's something that Russia under Putin will not tolerate, and it feels threatened. But I think, the argument saying that NATO is encroaching on Russia is a fallacious one. It's a spurious one because, as I say, NATO has been on Russia's border since 1949. The alliance has existed for 73 years and has never attacked Russia. So I think it also plays into the domestic politics of Russia, where Putin doesn't want to be challenged by any internal challenges. And one of the best ways for a strong man to support the population behind him is to embark on a foreign war. We saw this with the breakaway republic of Chechnya in the end of the 1990s when Putin came to power. We saw this with Georgia. We saw this with Ukraine in 2014. So there's a pattern here. And it's asking serious questions of the international system and the international community.
Yeah, breach of international laws. That's one of the reasons given, description given by the NATO Secretary General, that the action of Russia is not only a breach of international laws, but a serious threat to Euro-Atlantic security. I want you to explain briefly some of these international laws that, the invasion of Ukraine is in breach of.
Very simply, the United Nations Charter and a whole lot of international law says that states are sovereign. They have territorial integrity, which means the state must be kept together. They have sovereignty, which is the right to decide on their own affairs, and that they shouldn't attack one another. And that's exactly what Russia has done. It has sent its troops by land, by sea, and by air into a neighboring country completely unprovoked. And it is trying to install a government that it is to its liking, a compliant government. And so it has breached those very important rules that the international system has been upholding since 1945. And of course, even before that, but certainly since 1945, that states don't attack one another, that states don't invade one another. And so I think it's that set of international laws and principles that Russia has absolutely flouted by this invasion.
Okay, staying with NATO, I think one of the arguments being put out is that because Ukraine has not been absorbed into NATO, they cannot send in troops to help them with this fight. But we see that the world is rallying around to provide them with some sort of assistance with the sanctions that are being imposed. But do you think that these sanctions, which actually takes a little time to have some sort of impact, will it work where dialogue seems to have failed?
So first I want to take your question about NATO. Article 5 of the NATO Charter says that an attack on one will be considered an attack on all. So if one country gets attacked in the alliance, and as I said, there are 30 members of the NATO alliance, if one of them is attacked, the other 29 are obliged to come to its defense. They are not obliged to defend Ukraine because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So there's no obligation. But what individual states have decided, and many of them are NATO states, they are sending aid, they are sending money, they are sending equipment to Ukraine to try and repel the Russian invasion. The question of sanctions is an important one, and short of going to war, that's what mainly the Western countries have decided they want to do to put pressure on the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine. So there've been low-level sanctions on Russia since at least 2014, and that's caused Russia to look for other markets because it was shut out of many Western markets. And but a lot of the sanctions were what they call smart sanctions on particular members of the Russian government or the class of elite oligarchs, rich men that Putin is surrounded with and who really own the Russian economy. So these sanctions are quite considerable. They have blocked the assets of rich Russians and politically connected Russians. They have blocked business with banking. They have disrupted international trade. The EU said that Russia can't fly into the EU, and then Russia retaliated by saying, well, then the EU can't fly into Russia. There's a whole range of quite serious sanctions. I don't think we've seen sanctions before, like this in living memory. I mean, if you think about the sanctions that were put against Rhodesia or apartheid South Africa, they took years and years and years to put in place, and these are going to be in place within a week. I think that they are quite serious. They're going to definitely affect the Russian economy. The central bank raised the interest rate by more than 50%, from 9.5% to 20% in a day. The Russian ruble has collapsed. So I think part of the kind of two aims of the sanctions. One is to bring Russia to its knees economically so that it will sue for peace. And the other one, which isn't stated so often, but is that maybe there will be an internal uprising against Putin, that his coterie, his patronage network will decide that he's more of a liability than an asset, or there may be a popular uprising, or there may be some way that he is shifted out of power because of the pressure that the sanctions are putting on him. Of course, Putin knew that these sanctions were coming. The invasion was not something he decided yesterday. So Russia has been stockpiling cash and to try and mitigate against the sanctions. Russia has very good relations with China, and China might be able to bail it out to a certain extent economically. So I think the sanctions are a big risk, and they're definitely going to hurt the Russian people, but it's also going to have ripple effects on all of us. We live in a very interconnected world, a globalized world, and what's happening in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, is going to affect you sitting in Nigeria or me sitting in South Africa. It's going to affect ordinary people on our continent.
And that's part of the reasons why we're having this conversation, to see how it's going to impact us and what lessons we can actually learn from it. This would be a good point to take a short breather. I think we've been able to establish to some degree what these issues are. We'll take a short breather now, and on the flip side, we'll focus on the humanitarian situation and the treatment of Africans fleeing the conflict. Join us again. Good to know you're still with us. We're still talking about the Russian and Ukraine conflict. The invasion is of concern to everyone across the globe, and we're talking about how it is going to be impacting us here in Africa. I still have Steven Gruzd speaking to us from South Africa. Thank you very much for sticking around. Before we go to the alarm bells that are chiming, I want to ask you quickly, there is a dialogue, a possible dialogue at some Belarusian border, I think, between the Russian and Ukraine. Do you see that having any effect? Because the Zelensky doesn't seem to have faith that a lot will come out of that meeting.
So I think when you're looking at conflict resolution, there's something called ripeness of a conflict to be resolved. When both parties make the calculation that stopping fighting is more advantageous to their interest than continuing fighting. And having looked at conflicts before, for me, I don't think that this conflict is yet ripe for resolution. I think the Russians still think they can win. They can subdue the Ukrainians. They can push all the way to Kiev, the capital. They can take big cities like Kharkiv and others, and that they will be able to install a friendly government in Ukraine. So I don't think that this particular conflict is over yet. And there have been talks, as you say, on the Belarusian border, but Ukraine doesn't trust Belarus because Belarus allowed Russian troops, to come through its territory, to use its territory. And President Lukashenko is very close to President Putin. So one of the small victories for Ukraine was they refused to go to Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, for the talks. They said they would talk on the borders. Zelensky himself said he doesn't have much faith in these talks, but he is going to send senior government officials, including some ministers, to go to these talks, because even if there is a small chance that they could lead to peace, he doesn't want to be seen not taking that chance. And I mean, I think he's been an inspiration and a masterful user of the media and social media to keep the Ukrainian spirit buoyed, to keep the international community focused on this. But yeah, so the talks concluded, and then they've said that there will be another round of talks. I'm all for talks. I think it's much better to be talking than to be shooting. But whether this particular conflict is ready for resolution, I don't think so. I think one side, and that side is Russia, thinks it can still win on the battlefield. I think it's losing badly in the media, social media and regular media. I think Ukraine is coming out on top by far. Putin is increasingly isolated. Russia looks like it's isolated and out of touch, and its reasons for what it's doing just don't make sense to the majority of people.
I mean, however you look at it, is the civilian part of it, the people that suffer when two major powers fight like this, and we're already seeing the toll coming up. And the alarm bells I referred to is quite appropriate because the humanitarian situation will be escalating as the day goes by. What do you foresee with the humanitarian situation of this conflict in the coming days?
Yes, I think, all conflicts are terrible, but I think this one has the potential to be even worse. Russia used a lot of firepower, a lot of troops to invade, but it's being held up and it's being resisted strongly by the Ukrainian army and by ordinary Ukrainians. And so I think Russia has a lot more weapons in its arsenal, and it'll probably, as the Americans like to say, double down, send in more troops, send in more weapons, send in more missiles to try and crush the Ukrainian resistance. And I think the humanitarian situation is terrible. 600,000 people have already fled. They're having trouble getting on trains. They're having trouble driving. They're having trouble getting petrol. Of course, the airspace is closed. There are no flights. You can see these great charts on international news programs. And over Ukraine, there just are no airplanes flying at all. So it's much harder to get out. People are hunkered down in their in subway stations, in underground train stations, in their houses. And we've seen buildings being attacked in both Kiev and Kharkiv and other places. They're not just military targets. Civilians are starting to get killed. The Ukrainians, I think, have said over 300 people killed. I may be wrong on that figure, so don't quote me. But many left homeless, many internally displaced, and everybody's making for the border, of course, including African students and workers and others that have been in Ukraine. And you were talking about some of the numbers. I think you said 4,000 Nigerian students. Yes, I know there were a couple of thousand Ghanaian students. They are all, like everybody else, rushing to the borders and trying to get away from this conflict.
That's the part of the conversation I want us to talk about. Everybody's trying to flee to safety, but it seems there is a kind of selective treatment for Africans especially. While on the one hand, Poland is being commended for bringing in these refugees, on the other hand, there are concerns. The AU has spoken against it. The Nigerian government has spoken against it. Some of the African leaders are speaking. What worries you about this development?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think not everybody has been treated equally and fairly. I think there are a lot of African students and other workers and other people who were in Ukraine who are on the move and are just as fearful for their life and just want to get home. And I think agreeing with the African Union, agreeing with your government and mine and many others, there has been racist treatment. People have been apparently turned away from the borders, have been told that white refugees get preference. We've seen footage of this, and I think it's very unfortunate. It's very racist, and must be countered and must be called out, because everybody as a refugee or as somebody leaving a country should have the same rights, and the color of your skin should really not matter. I think the Polish and Hungarian and other countries that are bordering on Ukraine are facing a massive flow of refugees, but there's no excuse for racism. There's no excuse for turning away people who are desperate to leave a country. So I think it's very unfortunate, as I said, because everybody's airlines are grounded. There can't be airlifts of these people, so they have to make their way to one or other of the borders on foot or by bus or by train. And they're joining thousands and thousands of Ukrainian women and children who are also trying to get away. Many of the men have stayed to fight or have been conscripted. So it's mostly women and children on the Ukrainian side, and it's mostly students, I think, on the African side. But very unfortunate. As you say, the African Union has made a statement, other governments have made statements, and I think our governments have an obligation to do everything possible to get our young men and women and older men and women home safely.
I want to take your thoughts as well on the response of the Polish government to the accusations of racism. They're saying nobody's turned back, no matter the nationality. Do you think, in the face of the acknowledgement and video evidence across a board, that should be the right response from Poland? What kind of response will de-escalate this simmering racism accusation? And we know how volatile that can get.
I think that Poland has to take a hit here and has to own up and has to say, yes, mistakes were made. They are very regrettable. I think they have to be in contact with their border police and those who are manning the border post, give them clear instructions that everybody is to be treated equally, that there has to be an orderly, as much as possible, way of getting the refugees and the people fleeing out of Ukraine. So I do think that by denying it, Poland's going to look foolish and is going to look dishonest. And I don't think any government wants that view, given that as we know around the world, racial tensions are very volatile, and this is just another layer of unnecessary hurt and pain and conflict on an already hurtful, painful conflict.
Well, the next question is going to be in two areas. On the one hand, I want to get your response to your assessment, rather, of how African leaders are responding to the issues of being raised now of racism. And on the other hand, what's your assessment of their response to, I mean, the situation didn't need to get to the point where you're now looking for ways to evacuate your citizens, knowing fully well that this invasion did not just happen overnight. It's been, there's been indication that this was going to happen. Why did they wait up until the point now nothing can be done other than going to the borders and trying to get your citizens out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole world was the world was shocked at how brutal the invasion has been. But, intelligence services and governments have been warning for months that Putin was not bluffing, that he was going to invade. So I think embassies should have perhaps done their homework a little better and prepared for this eventuality. been in touch with all their nationals and their citizens, given them instructions on what to do in the case of an invasion and in the case of a crisis like this. I don't see much evidence of that having been done. I must commend African ambassadors, though. I think a lot of them have gotten in their cars from Warsaw or from whichever capital they're sitting in and have gone to the borders and have tried to plead with border guards and have talked to their nationals. I know the South African ambassador has certainly done that and is doing everything they can to try and help their nationals. It is maybe a bit of a little too little too late. I think everybody was hoping that this conflict wasn't going to happen. But once it's been in motion, it seems to be quite chaotic. And the interesting thing for me, and we can maybe talk a bit about this if you like, is the response from many African governments has been mainly about their own citizens trapped in Ukraine or trying to get out. I think there's been a general reluctance to be too critical of Russia by various African states. And if you'd like, I'm happy to.
I really would like you to speak on that. Yes, please go ahead.
So what was interesting was, of course, as we know, 3 African countries sit on the UN Security Council every year. They're non-permanent members they are 3 out of the 15 Security Council members, and it's done on a rotational basis. And at the moment, it just so happens that the 3 countries are Kenya, Ghana, and Gabon. And in the run-up to the invasion, Kenya spoke. Ambassador Martin Kimani, who's the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, spoke very powerfully and said that this matters to Africa, that this is a threat to the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a peaceful UN member state. It should not be tolerated. It has echoes of colonialism, where countries far away carved up the borders of Africa. If we were to take every territorial dispute and try and change the border, we would have had more chaos on our continent for the last 60 years. So he was very strong. And then this matter was taken to the UN Security Council, and they were going to vote on a resolution that would have condemned Russia. And all 3 African countries, Kenya, Ghana, and Gabon, all spoke out very strongly and supported the resolution that was jointly tabled by the US, and I'm trying to remember which other country, it'll come to me. And they strongly supported the resolution, but it didn't pass because Russia has a veto, and it vetoed the resolution, and other countries abstained, and there were 3 countries, which was China, India, and the United Arab Emirates. Everybody else voted in favor, but because Russia has a veto, that resolution was not passed. So then, as often happens, the issue is then tabled at the General Assembly, where there are 193 member states, and of course, 54 of those are African, so a little over 25%. And what we say matters. And so I was watching earlier on the television the speeches on the floor of the UN building in New York, and the Ukrainian ambassador made a very impassioned, very emotional plea. The Russian ambassador was rather more sticking to what he thought were the facts, but I don't think everybody would agree with his interpretation of what the facts were. And then it moved to the other countries. So I think, personally, for me, where I see, this conflict is a very clear-cut imperialist move by one country to bully and to try and subjugate another one. I think we can be very proud of our African representatives. Of course, not everybody agrees with me. Some feel that NATO is encroaching, that this is not Africa's war, that this is just American imperialism, arrogance, and ambition that's threatening Russia, that there are double standards because America has gone into Iraq and gone into Afghanistan and gone into Libya and gone into so many other places over the last 50 years that it has no right to be lecturing other countries on democracy. It has no right to be arming the Ukrainians and shouldn't and is provoking Russia. I don't agree with that point of view, but that is a point of view that one does hear in African circles.
Yeah, sadly, that's what it is. All right. What are some of the lessons for Africa from the Russian-Ukraine conflict? We will explore that when we return from this break. At least let's allow Steven get a glass of water. He's been talking for a bit. Join us again. Glad you're still with us. Let's get right back to it. Now, while most attention has focused on the implications of this crisis for transatlantic relations and NATO unity, there are those who say the invasion of Ukraine presents a significant test of the concept of Pan-African solidarity and regionalism. I mean, Steven alluded to that earlier, and I'd like to share, I want you to share your view on this. Is this true? Is it going to challenge the concept of Pan-African solidarity, and how is that going to happen?
So I think first, just maybe if I can just set the scene a little bit and say why I believe that this matters for Africa. I mean, the most obvious one is the oil price, which has gone over $100 and could shoot up further. We've just had a big announcement of a big fuel price increase in South Africa, and I'm sure it's the same across the continent. It might be good for a country like Nigeria, which produces oil, but I think that would be a very short-term gain. Once the petrol price goes up, then the food price goes up, and the transport price goes up, and that's going to hit the poor people in our continent very, very badly. I think international travel, as we've already spoken about, is going to be disrupted. The countries that, for example, produce cut flowers are not going to be able to sell those in European markets as easily as they were previously. You know, there are all these knock-on effects. I'm not an economist, but it's clear that there will be repercussions. Another one is for North African countries in particular, like Morocco, Algeria, Egypt. They're very dependent on grain for their bread from both Russia and Ukraine. If this is a protracted war, that trade could be disrupted and poor people could suffer there. In terms of Pan-Africanism, I think this is an issue which may divide Africa in terms of those that are closer to the West and those countries that are closer to Russia and China. I mean, China in particular has become a massive player in Africa in the last 20 years. Russia in the last sort of 10 years has also been expanding back into Africa after it basically left after 1991. There are more embassies opening. There are more Russian private military companies fighting in some of Africa's wars and securing some of Africa's governments. So you'll have those that are politically closer to Russia, and you'll have those that are politically closer to the West. And this issue could divide. So, for example, as I said, Kenya, Gabon, and Ghana have all nailed their colors to the democracy mast. Contrast that with somewhere like South Africa, which has flip-flopped on what it wants to say. So I'll give you very briefly what's happened. Firstly, in the build-up to this, South Africa was almost dead silent. Of course, it is in the BRICS arrangement with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it has close ties to Russia, and it has had close ties to Russia all the way through the liberation struggle and the post-1994 scenario in South Africa. So first it kept quiet. Then on the 23rd, there was a statement issued by the Department of International Relations and Cooperation saying that they are concerned about the situation, that everybody must keep talking, that war is not a response, and that we should give diplomacy a chance. That evening, or the early hours of the morning, the attack was launched on Ukraine. So on the 24th, South Africa issued another press statement from DIRCO, this one saying squarely and clearly that Russia must withdraw its troops and respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of its neighbor, Ukraine. And it firmly put the emphasis on Russia. Again, saying that there must be dialogue, that the Minsk process, that the Normandy formula must be followed, etc., and that this should be settled. Then the President Ramaphosa backtracked from that a little bit and said, no, South Africa is neutral. This is not for us to pick sides. And in fact, the responsibility is on the United Nations to deal with this, to mediate this, and to end this. and he stuck to his guns on that. So there's been confusion, mixed messages coming from different departments, and South Africa is clearly not wanting to upset Russia. As I said, from what I've seen of the other African countries, there haven't been too many statements that have put governments on one side or the other. They have conveniently been able to focus on getting their nationals out. That's where the emphasis has been from most other countries, rather than making declaratory statements. But moving to the lessons, I think, as you said, I think this is a test for the international system. And I think for African countries whose democracy has been so hard fought for, as you know, in your part of the world, coup d'etats were regular occurrences for many, many years. I think the sad thing is that they've come back in some of your neighbors and countries like Mali and Guinea and Guinea-Bissau and attempts in Burkina Faso and others. So I think the resurgence of coups must give us pause. But democracy has been so hard fought for and so hard won. And yes, our democracies aren't perfect. I think there's a lot that we can do to improve our connections with our citizens and the way that our countries are run.
Okay.
But I think
I need to interject here. I need to interject here in the interest of time and try and connect your comment about the hesitancy to take a stand by some African countries with this mindset that when push comes to shove, because you talked about diplomacy, it doesn't seem to have worked. African leaders, AU, and all the relevant bodies have come up to say, let's try one way. It's not working. When push comes to shove, it seems major powers like Russia will unapologetically pursue their national interests unilaterally with no regard for diplomacy. What's the lesson here for Africa?
I think the lesson for Africa is that as small states in the international system, we have to A, stick together, and B, fight for those principles that so many people have shed blood for in our various countries in order to have a government by the people, for the people, of the people, as the Americans would say. I think the future of the international system is at stake. I think the future of the UN is at stake. This might be an opportunity for African countries to push for much needed reform of the United Nations and particularly the Security Council. There's been no impetus for that, and sometimes it takes a crisis to refocus minds and to get institutions to change. I think African countries have to stand up for principles, and so far our representatives on the Security Council have done that. I think we have to stand up to bullying. I think we have to stand up to breaches of international law. We have to stand up to brutality and savagery and say, this is not us. This is not how we behave. This is not how the international system was created. This is not how countries behave towards one another. I think we have to put our foots down. So I would like to see more statements. I commend the African Union. I commend the countries that have spoken up, but I think there's room for more. And I think as this conflict wears on, Russia's excuses become thinner and thinner, and we are not able to. I think there's all the more reason for African countries to stay together and to stand up for what's right.
Okay, there's another part of this conversation. I don't know if it's too early to be talking about it, but there are comments already in some quarters that Ukraine seems to be unfortunate to find itself in the playfield of a great power rivalry between the US and its allies on the one hand, and the Russians on the other hand. The fact that, let me read it the way I wrote it here, the fact that Ukraine is not considered a core strategic interest that the US is ready to fight for, to confront Russia's military might with their own, it doesn't bode well for African nations. It seems weak states suffer the brunt of destruction when major powers play this dangerous game, strategic game, some have described it as. Again, I want to ask, is there a lesson here for Africans to take? At the end of the day, we're your friend, and then when it comes down to it, personal interest takes supremacy.
So I think there's a well-known African proverb, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And we are sometimes caught in a bad neighborhood or in an area where we are subject to great power rivalry. Again, I'll come back to saying that African countries have to uphold the rule of law. They have to uphold international law. And we have a say. We make up 25% or more than 25% of the General Assembly. African votes matter. African votes count. And I think we're seeing Putin increasingly isolated on sporting fronts, on cultural fronts. I just saw now Hollywood is not going to, Disney, for example, said it's not going to have any premieres in Russia. Films are not going to be shown. They won't be able to play football or hockey or ice skating or Eurovision Song Contest. Those are small things, but they all mount up. And I think African countries have to make a choice and stand up, as I said, for what's right and for the principles of the international system. Because today Ukraine, tomorrow, who will it be?
Indeed, or who will it be? You talked about it earlier, some of the impacts of these crises on Africa, including the price of oil. And then we also know that the supply chain for agricultural produce between Ukraine and African countries will be really, really affected. My question this time, as we wind down, is what should be African leaders' strategy to cushion the impact of some of these economic rebound, I don't know if that's the right word now, on an already suffering masses in Africa? What should be their strategy?
I wish I had good ideas for this one. We are all suffering from a global downturn. We've all had COVID for 2 years, affecting our countries, which is with lockdowns and shutdowns and disruptions to trade, and shaving points of our gross domestic product. It's tough times, and I think we have to recognize that. But again, solidarity is important. I think we have to use it as an opportunity to remake our systems, to, as Joe Biden says, build back better after the pandemic. And this isn't going to help. A major war in the heart of Europe is only going to make things more volatile. As I said, maybe in the short term, the gold price will go up, and that's good for countries like South Africa and Ghana that produce gold. Metal prices are going to go up. Platinum group prices have gone up. So there may be short-term gains, but I think there's going to be long-term pain. I think governments need to protect their citizens. So I think they should do everything they can to get their citizens out of Ukraine. And maybe that means saving money by not flying to the next international conference. Do it by Zoom. We've all learned to do that. That could be some millions that could go towards helping your citizens. I think being informed and understanding this conflict and where your country fits in. I think solidarity between countries and sharing of information. And again, I'll come back to it. I keep coming back to it. I think standing up for sovereignty, standing up for territorial integrity. And yes, in this case, it's Russia, but in other cases, it has been other powers. And I think the only hope for weaker countries is to band together and to stick together and not be divided by the great powers, but to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that happening among African leaders coming? And that will be a rare thing indeed. As we wrap up, what would be your final thoughts for this conversation, really, for Africa generally, as we watch things unfold and feel the impact?
I think, firstly, to say thank you to News Central TV for having me. It's also great to have had a whole hour with you, Felicity, to really unpack these issues. Usually we get a few seconds or a few minutes, and it's difficult to have long explanations, and I apologize if my explanations
we even want more, actually, if we have more time, because the more people are educated, the better decisions we can make.
Sure. So I think Africa can't afford to ignore this. I think we have to try and buffer our economies to withstand what's going to come as best as possible. I think we have to show solidarity for the human beings whose lives are in danger, of the people who've been killed, who've been injured, who have been exiled, who have become refugees overnight. I think we have to put pressure on Russia to desist. I think we have to show support for Ukraine. Again, I think this one for me is very clear cut, and there's a clear aggressor and a clear defender in this particular conflict. I think we shouldn't equivocate. I think we like to say both sides must come to the table, both sides must cease violence. I think in this one, there's a clear moral line as to who is it at fault. I'm happy to take on people who think differently, but this is. You'll remember where you were the day this war started, and I don't think the international system is going to be the same again.
I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Steven Gruzd, for your time with us in One Slot.
Thanks, Felicity.
All right, before I say my goodbyes, here's my 2 cents. Russia has been expanding its influence in Africa in recent years, and after this invasion of Ukraine, I am certain it will be expecting its newfound allies to provide support or at least remain neutral. It is on this issue I'd like to make this submission, that African leaders must be reminded that diplomacy is an inconvenient barrier to the unilateralism of major powers when their interests are threatened, and as such, they must be guided in their decisions accordingly. Thank you very much for watching. Until next week, stay informed and be safe.